All right, so we had a lot of people registered for this event, and I want to say thanks for making some time and just saying hello and welcome. The California Climate and Energy Collaborative team and our friends at CARB are really pleased to welcome you to the listening session today. I want to just thank you for making time to be here. We've got you for a couple of hours. We know that's a big chunk of time. We'd really love it, since this is an interactive listening session, if you would turn your webcam on, if you're comfortable. And also, we'd really appreciate it if you take some time now while folks are streaming in to just introduce yourself over chat, since there's too many of us to do it out loud. Sadly, we'd love to hear all of your voices. We hope to hear them throughout the 2-hour session, but if you can just introduce yourself over chat, that would be great. I'll start. I'm Angie Hacker. I'm the CEC statewide best practices coordinator, joined today by a couple other members of the CEC team, Kelsey, John, and Tila. All right, next slide, please. So you guys, this is the first of 3 listening sessions. So if you've registered for today, you're sort of on board for the others as long as you can make it. Our goal for these sessions, when we started working with CARB on how we want to, what did we want to do here together? We decided we want to deepen the valuable collaboration between local governments and CARB and help inform CARB's plans for future potential programs and services, things that they can do to help local governments more successfully advance substantial emission reduction strategies. And this first listening session there on the left at the top, the first of 3, we're really aiming to achieve a collective understanding of the experiences, needs, and barriers local governments face in pursuing climate action within their communities, and of the state's efforts to support local climate action. So we're going to deconstruct local climate action. The agenda is over on the right for our next 2 hours. I'm going to do a tiny bit of ground setting, and then I'm going to hand it over to our friends at CARB, and they're going to talk a little bit about their approach to coordinating with local governments on climate action or climate change and climate action. We were fortunate to have 4 local government speakers from 4 different jurisdictions offer to speak about their experiences. So they'll each get 5 minutes to kind of share their climate action experiences. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Boswell over at Cal Poly. He is the premier researcher and local climate action expert here in California. He's going to kind of give us an overview of some of his, the status of local climate action here in California and some of his research. And then we're going to have some substantial time for breakouts. We're going to have really good conversation. Intermixed in here is some Q&A discussion as well. So lots of points of opportunity for interaction. I want you to be very comfortable raising your hand and throwing things in the chat as well throughout. So just for a second, just to kind of ground set on this topic, this is a big topic, right? I think most folks know that local governments have been at this a while. There's over 300 of California's 540 or so municipalities that have a climate action plan, and plenty of others are implementing various emission reduction strategies. So some of you have been working to combat climate change for decades, arguably perhaps even got an earlier start than our great state. And even pioneering the path towards carbon neutral, clean energy future for all for a while. And those of you that were doing this from, I don't know, the 90s, did this with no playbook, very little money, and the weight of the world's disbelief against you. So I want to first say thanks to all of you for your help getting us here, which is sort of, as you know, a critical point in history where we have a chance, right? We have a chance to get a hold of these emissions, turn this ship around, and try to avoid the worst case scenario before it becomes inevitable. So, we just went through a rough winter. It's another sign that avoiding that worst case scenario is a burden definitely worth bearing, and one that's really belongs to our generation. So that's why we're here today. The state of California has set aggressive emission targets, and we believe local governments play a key role in implementing those community-based measures, the stuff that can't be done by industry or by state regulation. And so we want to find a way to more collectively and more effectively unlock local potential to reduce emissions. So I want to hear from you guys real quick. Give me a virtual thumbs up or a real thumbs up if you know that your jurisdiction has some emissions on the tables. You can do more to reduce emissions in your jurisdiction. Give me a thumbs up if that's true for you. All right. Yep, I see some thumbs. Okay, so the focus today is going to be on freeing municipalities up to take meaningful and sufficient action. The right measures in the right size as quickly as possible and somehow fund it into existence. So I want to say thank you big time to CARB for having us at this conversation, bringing us together. They're here to help us identify ways that they can help alleviate barriers to action. And the last thing I want to say is just, there's going to be disagreement in this room, honest disagreement about how to move local governments forward faster. And this is really the right place to get to the root of some of those disagreements. And I'm just excited to be here with you all to have a respectful, constructive conversation about it, remembering that we generally all really have the same goals in mind. And so my belief over the last couple of years is that if we can bring together state and local agencies more in a more constructive, true partnership in a closer way, it's one of the most important things we can do to boost our collective efforts. So that's all I wanted to say. I just wanted to then move over to our next slide, talk a little bit about you guys, who's here. Thanks for answering the questions in the registration. Today, we have representatives from 24 cities, at least in the registration. Hopefully everybody shows up. 9 counties, 2 APCDs, 3 COGs, 1 transit district, 1 CCA, 1 climate collaborative. And that's a pretty good cross-section of the kinds of people that are involved in local climate action. And then folks told us if you were from rural, suburban, and urban, and that's how that breaks out in the pie chart on the right, probably a pretty good representation of the kinds of communities doing climate action across the state as well. So thanks again for answering those questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to our co-hosts and say thanks again for being here and coordinating with us on this important listening session. They're going to provide an overview of CARB's approach to coordinating with local governments on climate change. So Pedro and Shannon from the Sustainable Transportation and Communities Division are going to take it from here. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Angie. My name is Pedro Peterson. I manage the local planning section here at CARB, and I'll just say just a quick a couple of words that the work that we are doing here and the impetus for this convening really comes in the as a sort of result of the process that we went through to put together the local actions appendix to the scoping plan and a lot of the feedback that jurisdictions gave us during that process. So we want to sort of kick off this set of convenings and this conversation with local governments to make sure that we are partnering to advance the state climate goals. So Shannon Hatcher has a presentation that he will share with you all.
Hey everyone, I'm Shannon Hatcher. I'm an air pollution specialist in CARB's Sustainable Transportation and Communities Division, or STCD. A focus of our work in CARB is to help align climate efforts with the state's scoping plan, and we're here to share some of what the scoping plan says in terms of key recommendations for local climate action. Next slide, please. The scoping plan is the state's framework for achieving its climate goals. It was first adopted in 2008 and is updated every 5 years. CARB adopted the 2022 scoping plan update this last December to chart the state's path to carbon neutrality by 2045. This slide highlights some of the various benefits of the 2022 scoping plan update and shows that state efforts to meet its climate goals will result in unprecedented growth in clean technology and nature-based solutions. For example, it's anticipated that on-road zero-emission vehicles will increase 37-fold between 2022 and 2045, while fossil gas use for building energy will decrease by 91% over that same time period. Next slide, please. Moving to local climate action, local governments can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions within their jurisdictions, and this is critical to achieving the state's air quality and climate goals. This is because local climate actions consistent with the scoping plan help to create the necessary conditions for state policies to succeed. For example, local actions such as permit streamlining can facilitate the transition of existing energy infrastructure and the construction of new energy infrastructure that can help to advance state building and transportation electrification goals. In addition, local zoning and planning authority can help to conserve natural working lands, which is one of the foundations of the scoping plan update. In addition, local jurisdictions can also see benefits when taking climate action. The graphic on the left highlights some of the statewide benefits associated with the scoping plan that can be seen in local communities. More broadly, jurisdictions that align climate actions with the scoping plan benefit from more coordinated and consistent climate planning. And this can help to ensure local climate funding and resources are prioritized to the areas where action is needed most. Local jurisdictions that develop a CEQA qualified climate action plan, or CAP, can use it for CEQA streamlining, which I'll get to in a moment. And finally, efforts to reduce greenhouse gases within a community can result in local direct co-benefits, such as improved air quality, health, quality of life, decreased wildfire risk, and other environmental benefits. Local climate action aligned with the scoping plan also helps to advance equity and address racial and environmental justice at the local level. Next slide, please. With respect to how local governments can align their climate actions to state climate goals, I'm first going to talk about climate action plans. And this includes a discussion of the benefits of a CEQA qualified CAP, aligning CAP GHG reduction targets with state climate goals, and reducing greenhouse gases in the scoping plan's 3 priority areas. And this is even if a jurisdiction does not choose to prepare a CEQA qualified CAP. Second, I'll talk about CEQA and the scoping plan, and this includes evaluating and mitigating impacts from residential and mixed-use development projects in a manner consistent with the scoping plan, and also the scoping plan's guidance for CEQA greenhouse gas mitigation. Let's first, next slide, please. Let's first talk about CAPs. The state encourages local governments to adopt a CEQA qualified CAP, but what is a CEQA qualified CAP? Broadly, a CAP is a framework for quantifying, tracking, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions within a jurisdiction's purview. A CEQA qualified CAP, however, it goes above and beyond by meeting specific criteria that's outlined in the CEQA guidelines for a plan for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The CEQA guidelines allows for individual projects that comply with the strategies and actions of a CEQA qualified CAP to tier and streamline its project-specific CEQA greenhouse gas analysis with minimal effort. This slide here, it lists the criteria for a CEQA qualified CAP as spelled out in section 15183.5b of the CEQA guidelines. And these criteria include preparing an inventory, establishing reduction targets, which are typically aligned with the scoping plan's climate goals, forecasting the jurisdiction's emissions, identifying reduction measures to meet the CAP's reduction targets, establishing monitoring mechanisms to measure the CAP's progress and make adjustments if it's off target, and finally, being adopted through a public review process following CEQA environmental review. Next slide, please. I wanted to briefly mention that using a CEQA qualified CAP to provide CEQA tiering for future projects has been successfully used by jurisdictions throughout the state. One of the early ones that's still in use is San Francisco's greenhouse gas reduction plan. Their plan's been continually and successfully used since it was first adopted in 2010, and it's used almost exclusively for CEQA greenhouse gas analyses within San Francisco. This isn't an endorsement of San Francisco's greenhouse gas reduction plan, but it's just an example of one of many CEQA qualified reduction plans that's used for CEQA streamlining purposes. Next slide, please. Let's now turn our focus to what the scoping plan says about preparing a CAP, starting with greenhouse gas reduction targets. A CAP's reduction targets should meet specific criteria, which are summarized on this slide. First, substantial evidence should support the targets not being cumulatively considerable from a CEQA perspective. Second, they should align with the state's climate targets and should include the years 2030 and 2045 at a minimum. Third, targets should align with and account for state reduction policies, programs, and strategies outlined in the scoping plan. Fourth, they should consider their share of the statewide reductions based on the jurisdiction's local characteristics, such as population and demographics. And finally, a CEQA qualified cap should meet the criteria specified in section 15183.5 of the CEQA guidelines. Please note that the scoping plan does not make recommendations for specific reduction targets, such as jurisdiction-wide carbon neutrality by 2045. And this is because jurisdiction-specific inventory, distinctive sources, and profile should be reflected when the jurisdiction is developing and aligning their local reduction targets to the state's climate goals. Next slide, please. Now that we've talked about setting local reduction targets, let's turn our attention to where jurisdictions should focus when they're taking local climate action. To help align local climate actions with the state's climate goals, the scoping plan identifies 3 priority areas where local action is most critical. And these 3 scoping plan priority areas are building decarbonization, transportation electrification, and VMT reduction. CARB considers these to be priority areas because they represent the greatest greenhouse gas reduction opportunities, which local governments have the most authority over. And we also recommend that local jurisdictions enact reduction activities that advance these 3 priority areas, as doing so helps to align their climate actions with our state climate goals, while also creating the necessary conditions for state climate policies to succeed. Next slide, please. I'd also like to mention that CEQA requires that projects analyze consistency with the scoping plan. So while the state encourages jurisdictions to adopt a CEQA qualified cap so that future projects could tier their CEQA analyses from that cap, the scoping plan also identifies other approaches local jurisdictions can consider for evaluating whether residential and mixed-use projects are consistent with the state's climate goals under CEQA. These approaches, which are listed on this slide, include qualitatively evaluating whether a project aligns with all scoping plan key priority area project attributes. Key priority area project attributes reduce operational greenhouse gas emissions, advance fair housing, and accommodate growth in a manner that's consistent with state greenhouse gas reduction and equity prioritization goals. A few examples of these project attributes include development in transit supportive infill sites, requiring all electric appliances in buildings, including at least 20% affordable housing, and providing EV charging infrastructure that meets the most ambitious Cal Green Code voluntary standard. Another CEQA approach that's identified in the scoping plan is quantifying and comparing a project's greenhouse gas emissions to a net zero threshold, although this approach may not be feasible nor appropriate for every project. And finally, the scoping plan also identifies an approach to compare project greenhouse gas emissions to a threshold recommended by an applicable air district or another lead agency. Before I move on to the next slide, I wanted to note that the scoping plan only includes guidance for evaluating residential mixed-use projects under CEQA, but we are continuing to explore this qualitative approach for other land use types. In addition, the approaches from the scoping plan are recommendations only and are not requirements. They don't supplant lead agencies' discretion to develop their own evidence-based approaches for determining whether a project would have a potentially significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Let's move on to the next slide, please. In addition to outlining approaches for analyzing CEQA impacts, the scoping plan also provides clarification on CEQA greenhouse gas mitigation through a geographical mitigation hierarchy. This mitigation hierarchy indicates that on-site design features that reduce greenhouse gas emissions should be first prioritized. And this is seen on the first level on this slide. After all on-site features have been implemented, the next priority is to seek off-site mitigation, as seen on the second level of this slide. Off-site mitigation is generally considered either an investment of funds in an off-site greenhouse gas reduction project or directly implementing an off-site GHG reducing project. When considering off-site mitigation, Local offsite reduction opportunities should first be prioritized, and after they're exhausted, non-local offsite reduction opportunities should then be incorporated. Once all local and non-local offsite mitigation has been exhausted, voluntary carbon offset credits should then be pursued. Offsets that are used as CEQA greenhouse gas mitigation are a specific subset of offsite mitigation that applies only to carbon offset credits that are purchased and retired from a recognized and reputable carbon registry on the voluntary market. And as seen on the last level of this slide, offsets should occur as close to the project site as possible in the following order of priority. Offsets originating in the same air basin as the project should first be considered. Excuse me. Followed by offsets elsewhere in California. And then as a last resort, offsets outside of California can then be considered. Finally, I'd like to note that offsets for the cap and trade program, which is a market-based program unaffiliated with CEQA, cannot be used as CEQA mitigation, as cap and trade offsets are a compliance grade program and may only be used by entities covered by the cap and trade program for compliance within that program. In addition to providing mitigation hierarchy, the scoping plan also provides clarity about the criteria or quality of greenhouse gas mitigation, be they local, offsite, or offsets. Rather than using the criteria from the cap and trade program, which include being real, additional, permanent, quantifiable, verifiable, and enforceable, lead agencies should instead look to CEQA statute, guidelines, and case law to ensure their greenhouse gas mitigation is supported by substantial evidence, enforceable, not otherwise required by law or regulation, and would not have occurred but for the requirements to mitigate that specific project's greenhouse gas impacts. If mitigation proposed by a project would have been implemented or required through another means, such as existing statute, regulation, local program, or a requirement other than the project that it's mitigating, then that project may not also claim credit for the reductions associated with that proposed mitigation. Using CEQA's requirements for mitigation helps to address concerns such as enforceability and additionality, including double counting of greenhouse gas mitigation. Next slide. That's the end of CARB's portion of the presentation, and here I've included our contact information if folks would like to reach out to CARB staff for any further questions, and I'll turn it back over to Angie.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Pedro. So, we're starting to get a few questions here in the chat and some comments. I thought maybe before we get to that, so a lot of what you're providing here in terms of how you're coordinating with local governments is through guidance that is in the scoping plan. And do you want to go into any more detail just about how you want local governments to use this? What's the theory behind how this can help them accelerate their climate action plans?
Yeah, some of the questions that we've received from stakeholders as we've been developing the scoping plan was, we really would like to take climate action, but we really don't know exactly where we should focus our efforts. And so that's really the basis for the priority strategies, the building decarbonization, transportation decarbonization, and VMT reduction. Kind of looking at those three areas is where we kind of saw the greatest opportunities, where local jurisdictions could really help the state in meeting our overall climate goals. Really, those are kind of the areas where we kind of see the biggest bang for the buck in terms of achieving the most substantial greenhouse gas reductions, where locals sort of had authority over some of those emissions.
All right, well, I want to invite folks to either raise your hand or put something in the chat. And actually, Supervisor Williams, glad you're here. Do you want to say this out loud, or I can read it for you? I want to give you a chance to do it out loud yourself if you'd like.
Sure. We prepared a climate action plan, and it's really clear to us that we're failing to achieve our share of emissions, and that the only way the data indicates we can turn it around is to have 117,000 electric vehicles on the road by 2030. So I imagine that's similar throughout the state, since vehicles are now accounting for such a huge share of emissions. But have you considered mandates on us, like universal fleet mandates? And then, when are we really going to see the geometric increase of charging stations that we keep on being predicted by some folks, or are we going to have to do it ourselves?
So thanks for that question. I guess, or that set of questions. So we have gone through a couple of major rulemaking processes recently, and are doing it now on mandating transition to zero emission vehicles. So we have our Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation that we passed last year that will require 100% ZEV sales by 2035. Advanced Clean Fleets regulation to push transportation network companies, TNCs like Uber and Lyft, to move their fleets, and creating carrots and sticks for them to move their fleets towards zero emission. The Advanced Clean Fleets regulation, and there's a suite of regulations to push not just local government fleets, but the overall fleet to transition to zero emission. So we don't have a plan other than the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation to push municipal fleets towards zero emission, but certainly have a set of incentive programs that can support that transition. So our Shannon mentioned during his presentation our cap and trade program. The proceeds from that program go into the greenhouse gas reduction funds that fund the suite of programs called California Climate Investments. And part of that is the low carbon transportation program that CARB oversees, that provides funding for individuals and households to purchase electric vehicles, and as well as car sharing programs, school buses and things of that nature. So so we do have that. Obviously we would love to have more resources to be able to do that, but the resources that come to us from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, we certainly try to create incentives for that transition. And as for the charging infrastructure, the federal government's Inflation Reduction Act has substantial funds to invest in charging infrastructure. The state has some of those funds too. The Energy Commission oversees a couple of programs to accelerate the deployment of charging infrastructure. So it's coming is the perhaps not fully satisfactory answer, but there's significant federal funding and some state funding to facilitate that as well. So the local governments are not on the hook to do it themselves.
And one of the things I wanted to, I just wanted to
Shannon, go ahead.
quickly kind of add on to what Pedro said is, like electric vehicle charging infrastructure, that's a great opportunity that locals can take for climate action planning in their CEQA processes, because, that's one of the key, tiers of the scoping plan. And, folks who are implementing those on a voluntary basis are, sort of setting themselves up with with actions that are consistent with what the state's envisioning. So, in terms of mandates, well, that's a TBD, but in terms of voluntary actions, that would be a great benefit to a jurisdiction, from a climate action and a CEQA perspective.
And I want to share here in the chat just a link about this ongoing Advanced Clean Fleets regulation, which probably is the closest thing to what Das was asking about in terms of municipal fleets. So
So Jody's chiming in here saying that we need help from the utilities with infrastructure needed for this, of course. And so actually, Supervisor Williams, there's a question for you there if you want to try to respond in the chat. I wanted to invite Ann. We're still on the topic of electric vehicles. Do you want to say this out loud, or I can do it for you? And close. Okay. So I'll read this. She's talking about a challenge that the city of Fresno facing with newly adopted ZEV for muni vehicles, muni fleets. So there's a variety of challenges for us to meet the new goals for our large fleets. For instance, a requirement for January 1, 2024, that 50% of medium and heavy duty vehicle purchases must be ZEV. So our major concern in particular is our utilities' inability to provide new electric service or load to city facilities. Specifically, we're trying to increase service and load. Okay, this is a long one. So I don't know if you can address these three questions here. What can we do if we face challenges to meet the requirements? We'll start there. Are you guys the ones that would work on this? Do you have intel on this? Okay.
What I'm curious what exactly the requirement is here.
I think she's talking about requirement for January 1, 2024, that 50% of medium and heavy duty vehicle purchases must be ZEV.
And that the utilities' inability to provide the electric services to
Right, like
achieve that.
what do they do if they can't meet these requirements?
I mean, I'm not sure. It seems like more of a question for the utility or the Energy Commission. We at CARB are more focused on the vehicle side than the charging infrastructure, and so certainly if you could send us that question and we could sort of try to find the right folks to address it within CARB.
Yeah, she's asking here, did CARB meet with the ISOs to discuss their ability to serve power in line with the timelines?
Yes, that is part of every regulatory process.
Okay, well, I think folks are just chiming in to say this is a really big barrier. So while they're doing their best on VMT with electric vehicles, fleets, and other, that the infrastructure is a real big challenge, and that there needs to be more coordination with the utilities. So that's good. That's a really good one. I don't want to get too far on the weeds on any one particular measure here, guys. We're talking to CARB about sort of higher level, maybe like what kinds of coordination do they have they done, or are they planning to do with local governments? And what kind of guidance and other support can they provide? So Anna Yip from Sonoma is asking, how does the state plan to support or encourage local carbon offset markets?
Yeah, it's a great question. And both on the VMT side and on the GHG side. So we are exploring alternatives and studying the potential opportunities to establish GHG mitigation exchanges as well as VMT mitigation exchanges, and to sort of try to understand the dynamics of establishing those markets, the appropriate scale for those markets, whether it be sort of local, regional, state level. So we have a solicitation currently out to hire researchers to sort of help us develop that work. We're working closely with the Office of Planning and Research and Caltrans to sort of understand sort of how to sort of do this better, and to create a set of guidelines that will hopefully help MPOs or air districts to create these opportunities. And as this progresses, we would love to sort of share the research and solicit input. I know Caltrans released a paper last year in conjunction with the law school at UC Berkeley on VMT mitigation. But yeah, it's something that we are very interested in, and investing some resources to understand better, and then eventually to provide some better guidance.
All right, let's do, we have some other speakers to get to too, and there's so much here. I'm taking these things because throughout these conversations, we're going to be talking about needs, right? What are these barriers? And then what are the solutions? And so I'm dissecting what you all are asking, trying to uncover what the need, barrier, or solutions are. So if I don't get your question right now, know that that's being done. Corey's asking a question here, Corey Downs from Chula Vista. What can be done to reduce electricity rates to further increase building and vehicle transition to electric fuels?
Again, the sort of questions about sort of electricity rates and infrastructure is something that is mostly outside of our jurisdiction. So I can, you have our contact information. If you can, I can sort of try to connect you to the right folks at the state level, but I'm not sure we are the most appropriate folks to talk about those particular types of questions.
Yeah. Okay, well, there's a lot of interest in here about EV and what it sounds like local governments are doing their best to try to move to EV, meet certain requirements, change over their fleets, and they're trying to communicate where the barriers are that they can't meet, they can't address them alone. So what they're asking is, you and other state agencies maybe that's a big area where the support could go a long way.
Absolutely.
And then Katie Van Dyke is saying local jurisdictions spend a lot of time and resources to develop and continually track or update our GHG inventories. We also know that we need to get to zero ASAP, which will not change. Trying to focus more on implementation of our CAP beyond just tracking emissions and creating more CAP documents. Hopeful that we can have state level resources to track the inventory level work and recommend this paper. So feel free to, if you want to respond to any of that. Not really a question there, but do you want to talk about support for that?
Let's see.
Sorry, was that a lot? That was Katie Van Dyke, and that was her number one.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so that's part of what we want to get out of this conversation is very much on sort of where the state can help with the development of inventories or sort of beyond inventories, thinking about how to, where to best sort of target our efforts. As you all probably know, there's a bill under consideration in the legislature that may provide some direction to us, but whether or not that bill passes or whatever form and direction we get from the legislature on this, we are trying to, understand where we can sort of help open up these bottlenecks. And, certainly it sounds like electricity supply and infrastructure is one of those areas. And so we will sort of take all of that under consideration and figure out where we can be the most helpful.
All right, well, yeah, so all of this is good wetting of the whistle for the conversations that we're going to continue to have over the 3 listening sessions. So even in the breakouts, barriers, needs, ideas, we're going to talk about all of that. So let's move in. I want to give us some time to now kind of dive in on some local experiences. So all of this is, right, we're deconstructing the process here a little bit so that everybody has a collective understanding of how it really works and what the needs really look like. And so I just want to give a chance for our 4 speakers who are generous enough to offer to speak a chance to talk. So we asked the speakers that I'm going to invite to speak to summarize a few things: their approach that their agency is taking to achieve local emission reductions, the role climate action planning has played in initiating action, and any key challenges, needs, lessons learned, or innovative solutions within their jurisdiction. So first up, I want to invite Alyssa Muto and Shelby Busso from the city of San Diego to share for about 5 minutes on their experiences. So thanks for offering, guys. Take it away.
Thanks, Angie. Do you want us to share, or do you want me to just share my screen? Oh, you've got it.
We've
okay.
got it. Yep,
All
don't
right,
worry.
Perfect. All right. Thanks for that. And yes, thanks for the time. We'll go through this pretty quickly. Alyssa Muto's on the line. She is our Director of Sustainability Mobility Department. And I'm Shelby Busso. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer and Deputy Director in the Sustainability and Mobility Department. If you want to go to the next slide. So there are a few key elements to the city's climate action work that are worth mentioning for this conversation. First of all, of course, is our climate action plan. The CAP is the key guiding document for our path towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions. As such, we've incorporated the CAP sections into council staff reports comprehensively and are making CAP connections to our grant seeking process, along with integrating the strategies all across the entire city. Our implementation plan is a living planning tool that is intended to guide the full implementation of the measures laid out in the climate action plan by clearly defining each city department's responsibilities and providing cost estimates over the next 5 years for those actions. The implementation plan contains information reported by each implementing department and will serve as an ongoing implementation tool. Also, annual departmental CAP work plans will be completed by each implementing department annually as a part of the budget process. And these CAP annual work plans will detail which CAP actions a given department will be addressing by fiscal year and the resources identified. By using this dual approach of both the implementation plan and the annual departmental work plan, the city both establishes roles and responsibilities for CAP actions and builds a system to budget and measure the successful implementation of those actions holistically. Next slide. So as some of you may recall, in 2015, San Diego adopted our current climate action plan, serving as establishing a goal of reducing our emissions about 50% by 2010 baseline by 2035. But of course, since then, the science told us that the window to reverse the trends of climate change is rapidly closing. The IPCC, of course, released their annual reports. They have several since then that were really sounding the alarm, calling for immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and improved air quality. And so we felt that the time for meaningful action is really now. We really didn't want to see the continuation of more extreme weather events, such as in San Diego, heat waves, droughts, rainstorms, that could disrupt our food systems and put pressure on our local water supply. And we acknowledge that the impacts of climate change will not be felt equally by all the communities that experience structural exclusion from land use, budgeting, and infrastructure decisions, as well as a historical lack of targeted resources and service investments will experience exacerbated inequalities. And so San Diego decided to address climate change with the urgency it requires, but lead with our communities of concern to ensure that we end this cycle of inequality and inequity. Our 2022 update to the Climate Action Plan does just that, setting an ambitious goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2035 and prioritizing our communities of concern. Next slide. So in order to achieve net zero by 2035, it's going to take a combination of federal, state, and local action. That top dotted line on the wedge chart in front of you represents the city's projected emissions with no action, or just our general, business as usual. We account then next in the large wedge there for federal, state, and regional actions that will reduce further our greenhouse gas emissions. But then we go into the local action needed, with each colored wedge shown to represent the projected greenhouse gas emissions reductions from each strategy in the CAP. Additionally, our 2030 and 2035 goals are shown on the graph with the stars. Next slide. So like I said, our overarching goal for climate emissions is to set more ambitious greenhouse gas emissions reductions, center climate equity, to quantify additional benefits of climate actions, for example, air quality improvements, technological advancements, cost savings, etc. We heard from over 4,000 residents during this engagement, and their number one voiced concern was air quality. But additionally, we also heard loud and clear there's a care and concern for our economy, public health, and resilience. Next slide. So residents, like I said, in our communities of concern expressed that they were severely impacted by poor air quality and wanted to see significant steps by the city to address this. And to respond to this input, we included a clean air section in the Climate Action Plan dedicated to air quality and bettering the public health of our residents. It outlines the strategies, measures, and actions that, while reducing and avoiding greenhouse gas emissions, will also improve air quality in communities. We coordinated these points in our plan with APCD and will continue to work with them collaboratively as we both implement our ambitious goals. All right, I think that's it. Next slide. So if you have any questions, you can email our general sustainability@sandiego.gov inbox or reach out directly to Alyssa or myself, and we'll be happy to have more further discussion or answer questions later.
All right, so actually we're going to do Q&A after all of the speakers speak, so we can move to the next slide. And I want to say thank you for, we try to get a cross section of different local governments here. So that was a great example of an individual, mostly urban city, doing a great job, not just with a cap, but updates and trying to build an equity. I really like their implementation plan. If you guys can drop links to some of these things into the chat, that would be really helpful, so everybody has access to some of these best practices. And really thank you for helping us, because local governments are really where the math of climate change hits the humanity of climate change. And so you're helping us have that conversation. Next up, I want to invite, making sure I get my names correct. We have the County of Sonoma, and we have Anna Yip. And I want to invite you up. You're up next for about 5 minutes to give us an overview. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Angie. Hi, everybody. My name is Anna Yip. I use she, her pronouns. I am the principal climate resiliency analyst here in the County of Sonoma. Our climate action and resiliency division is actually housed within our county administrator's office. And actually, if you don't mind going to the next slide, I'll give a quick overview of our division. So our approach to climate action and resiliency dates way earlier than the creation of our division where I work. The Climate Action Resiliency Division is actually a relatively new division to the County of Sonoma. I was brought on board as the first staff member for the division about 2 years ago. And like I said, it's a new division. It was created largely because of the County of Sonoma's 5-year strategic plan, which our Board of Supervisors recently adopted in 2021. And within that strategic plan, there's a climate action and resiliency pillar that outlines some goals and more specific objectives around climate action resiliency within Sonoma County. I want to just state up front here that we actually don't have a County of Sonoma climate action plan. So the strategic plan right now is very much looked at as our guiding document with regards to our work here within our office. I also want to note that while our division is relatively new, some of you all might be familiar or have crossed paths with folks or staff from the County of Sonoma's Energy and Sustainability Division, which was previously a part of our General Services Division, which has merged within our new climate division given as soon as our division was created. So it is again a new division, but because of some reorganization that happened within the county, we absorbed a division that has been in existence since I believe it was 2006. So our approach to working on climate action and resiliency is outlined underneath in the last kind of 3 bullets here. So first and foremost, I probably spent the first year in my position just taking stock. We have the privilege of having some really active folks within our county and community that are leading a lot of climate action work. And it was important for us to understand the existing efforts, previous efforts, and players already in the community and in the county, because like I said, there was a lot already going on. The next step is really kind of focusing on collaboration because we do have so many different players in the county and community. One of our main priorities and next steps was to figure out how we as the county, how I as an analyst within the county can best support ongoing and new efforts as I am needed and bringing people and entities to the same player. So when people ask me what I do in my job, I always say the number one priority or the number one responsibility that I have in the county is to bring people into a room to talk about things that they otherwise might not actually talk about. We, being within the county administrator's office, are oftentimes looked at as like the main hub and the kind of coordinator for countywide climate action. And then the last step in our approach so far has been to fill in the gaps. And what you see down here in that last bullet point is the kind of main efforts that we've been taking in the past couple of years to fill gaps. That includes doing a municipal greenhouse gas inventory, a waste audit and characterization study, a countywide carbon sequestration inventory and study. And now we're starting to embark on pulling together a municipal climate action plan, which will be the culmination of all of those other efforts that are in that last bullet point. Can you go to the next slide, Angie, please? So what I have up here, this is my last slide here, I kept it pretty short, are the key challenges and key successes that I have kind of noted in my role in these couple of years that I've been working within Sonoma County. The challenges are on the left-hand side. So it's a blessing and a curse, as I'm sure a lot of you are well aware of, having a lot of players. I had originally typed this out as too many cooks in the kitchen, but I have a small kitchen and I know how frustrating that can be. And I felt like that was too much of a frustrating connotation. So instead I shifted it to a lot of players because there are a lot of people that are already leading different kind of subsectors or specific efforts or initiatives within the county. And while that is great, it's also a big challenge for us because we don't want to recreate the wheel or find ourselves stepping on anybody's toes. And I honestly can't tell you how many times I have pitched an idea or even released an RFP and had somebody call me up afterwards and say, what the heck, isn't this what I'm doing? Or isn't this what so-and-so is doing? And so keeping track of all of that has been a challenge for us. And then another challenge that I wanted to bring up was figuring out what our role is as County of Sonoma within county versus community. And the reason why this is a specific challenge for us is Sonoma County, kind of tying to the first point, is lucky enough to have a regional climate coalition. So that we have RCPA, the first climate district within California, the Regional Climate Protection Authority. And they help work within or with jurisdictions and us as county as well to help create climate action and resiliency work and enforce different policies and procedures that are created and enacted. And so it's really figuring out, a challenge for us has been figuring out what our role is as County of Sonoma within the greater community, how much of our work is dedicated to countywide, community-wide, and how much of our work is focused more so on just county government operations or our municipal work. I know I've already gone over 5 minutes, so I'm going to skip over the other two challenges. I think those were the two most important ones, and just want to highlight some successes that are actually tied to some of the challenges. So because there are a lot of players in Sonoma County, that has brought up a number of key successes that have spurred from the fact that we have unique partnership opportunities. The first slide, Angie, I think that you had on our screen today was like what kind of community we are, whether we're rural, urban, suburban, and County of Sonoma. I mean, Sonoma County really is all of those. So we have a lot of unique partnership opportunities. I put a couple up there on the board. I'm happy to chat about if anybody wants to take that offline. And then also something that has been really great that our division does since we absorbed the energy and sustainability division is we offer a lot of services directly to our residents. And, you know, not only is that incredibly rewarding for us, but that actually helps us take our planning processes and planning documents that we create and actually implement them on the ground with residents here in our community. Okay, I will stop there and happy to answer any questions if folks have them. My email is on the first slide too, and also happy to chat about any of this stuff offline.
Thank you, Anna. Great job. I did this work at a county too, and I'm relating to a lot of the the considerations. So thank you. We're gonna move. So stick around because we're gonna have Q&A right after a couple more speakers. Next up, we have Omri from the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments, AMBAG, and so a different kind of agency represented here. So we'd love to hear your perspective, Omri.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Well, my name is Emery Berto. I'm the Sustainability Program Manager at AMBAG. We are the local metropolitan planning organization for Monterey County, San Benito County, and Santa Cruz County, just south of the Bay Area. I think very much like the County of Sonoma, we have some urban, we have some suburban, and we have a whole lot of rural. I will say, in my experience, the two biggest barriers to climate action are funding and staff capacity. CAPs, as we all know, are not revenue constrained. And so this requires staff to first obtain money to create a climate action plan. And then when the climate action plan is created, it requires staff to keep obtaining money to implement the climate action plan. Even for the most resource cities, this is just in my region an enormous challenge. And then for the jurisdictions that barely had enough money to create a cap or don't have the funding to create a cap, this is just an impossibility to get to the scale that we need. And so to me, this is really creating a situation in my region where I'm seeing underserved communities that are the most affected by climate change being the least able to implement climate action and to bring funding to their communities. It's just a huge barrier. So just to talk a little bit about what MBAG is doing, we've been working in this space about since 2006. We run a number of initiatives. We prepare greenhouse gas inventories for our jurisdictions. We help jurisdictions with local actions in their own facilities with energy efficiency, with electrification. And of course, we implement the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, Sustainable Community Strategy. And we're also branching out into natural and working lands and trying to quantify our sequestration potential in the region. So we've tried as much as possible to sort of take the burden away from local jurisdictions. In my region, we have 8 jurisdictions that have a cap. And out of those, I would say 2 or 3 are absolute rock stars. They would be doing climate action no matter what. I can leave them on their own and they come back and they have these amazing projects. And so when we first started this work, we felt, well, these 2 or 3 jurisdictions don't need our help. They can do it on their own. It's okay. And what we realized through really scrambling to find funding sources, to do greenhouse gas inventories, to do the education and outreach, to do regular inventories, is that even those most resource jurisdiction told us, well, when you do this more basic work, it allows me as a staff member to do more, to push the envelope, because I don't have to do this regular work. So what we've noticed with all of our sustainability initiatives is that, we can help jurisdictions really start the process of climate action planning by doing greenhouse gas inventories. We can help do outreach on even what a climate action plan is, what the process looks like, which is just so important for local elected officials to just understand even the concept of greenhouse gas emissions, all these different things. And then for the advanced jurisdictions, we can help by monitoring changes. And these are all things that we do, and we're constantly struggling to find funding for that the local jurisdictions really need. And so I think that would be a great role for CARB to step into, is sort of providing that technical assistance that really sort of makes the wheel go round on climate action. And then I will say, despite this baseline services that we've been able to provide, we are still noticing that most funding goes to the resource jurisdictions. Most climate action is still implemented in wealthy communities, and my underserved communities are still struggling. And I think that brings me to sort of the main barrier, and that is, I don't think at the rural and suburban scale that it is feasible for local jurisdictions to stand up the types of programs on their own that are needed to reduce VMT, to electrify their buildings. The economies of scale just are not there. And so that leads me to, I think, what we've now been implementing, which is a regional vision for climate action, where we really are trying to bring in all of our jurisdictions, create these regional programs, these regional applications to go forth and find funding. And I think that is truly how we could unlock sort of climate action and remove barriers, by having those very well-resourced jurisdictions, instead of acting on their own and getting grants on their own, really act as the thought leaders and as the examples, and then moving forward in a more collaborative manner. And that really would sort of start breaking down silos and make a big difference. The large issues is that currently there are no formal structure to do this type of work. And because each jurisdiction sort of prepares greenhouse gas inventories and climate action plans on their own, there's no centralized structure by which they can work together and standardize their inventories and standardize the measures that they have in their cap. And again, this is where creating a technical assistance, a document that would really help us with fostering that regional collaboration that the rural areas need in order to be able to scale up the climate action. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Marie, amazing as always. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you highlighting this difficult transition from the importance of a plan and then into actual implementation and what that means for a region to do that together. So thank you so much. And finally, last but not least, we have Abby Young from Bay Area Air Quality Management District. I think I got that right.
You did. Thank you, Angie. And I'm just going to confess that I started the meeting with a certain set of talking points, but as I've listened to speakers and as I've looked at the chat, I've changed that a lot because I think there's some really interesting points that are being brought up. So let me sort of jump in here and give a little bit of background. So I'm with the Bay Area Air Quality Management District that serves the better part of 9 counties of the Bay Area, from the wine country in the north to Silicon Valley in the south and out to the eastern parts of Alameda and Contra Costa County. The Air District has had a climate protection program since about 2006. And one of the first things we did was we initiated a one-time $3 million grant program. I think that was before that big recession and things were real flush and there was some extra money. So our board said, let's give out some climate grants. And I'm mentioning this because I think this speaks to a few things that have been mentioned. We had $3 million and we gave out over 50 grants. So this was a lot of, small grants, but a couple things that we did with them, I think were really interesting. The first thing we did was we gave some, 5-digit amounts of funding for over 20 local climate action plans in the Bay Area. It's kind of kick-started as a cohort that climate action planning, and that's great. But the more interesting thing that we did with it was, for a part of that funding, we thought, okay, how do we address long-term capacity issues for climate planning? And we operated under the assumption that if we could provide some seed funding for climate staff, within about a year's time, that staff could get local climate planning started and could potentially also work on a little bit of fundraising and implementing some energy efficiency projects that could then keep their position funded. And in fact, we seed funded, we probably provided about 2/3 of the funding for 7 different positions. And all of those positions, this was back in 2007, all of those positions still exist today. And they tend to be in either counties or cities where doing and updating local climate action inventorying and planning is not, they've got it down. They have resources for it and they can do it. That type of seed funding is so critical for not just the planning exercises, but even the thinking of how are you coordinating the implementation of your planning. And funding staff positions is not always the first thing that private or public agency funding programs think about when they think about climate planning. And I would just like to put out that it is a critical piece. And I've been trying to think about what's the opposite saying of penny wise and pound foolish. I guess it's the opposite of that. It's being pound wise. I don't know. It's investing today in long-term money savings and long-term benefits to local climate planning. So I wanted to mention that. And sadly, the Air District has not returned to that model. That was one thing we did, and we haven't done it again. So I'm giving myself that advice as well. But that kind of innovative thinking in terms of how do we address capacity issues. I'm seeing a lot of things in the chat about asking CARB to do things and, but also just freeing up resources to establish permanent capacity in local governments is something that I think is honestly very doable. When we so another piece that the Air District has done a little more, regularly since then is we've used CEQA as a, I don't know, it's a tool. Some people might call it a carrot, other people might call it a hammer. I don't know, depends on your perspective. But we've very much tried to align with what Shannon was describing as the state's approach, particularly through the scoping plan, to look at where we need to be in order to achieve carbon neutrality, and how do we put the policies in place today to get to that point. And so our most recent thresholds of significance for climate impacts that we put out about a year ago are not quantitative at all. They don't involve any bean counting. They involve policy approaches to projects and planning that will avoid the locking in of fossil fuels that will be very hard to get rid of by 2035, 2045, 2050. So it's aligned with the state, looking at how do we just get rid of fossil fuels in the building sector and in the transportation sector, and how do we get as close as we can to carbon neutrality. So we're trying to focus in a little more on what you might call quality over quantity. A lot of early climate action plans and the Air District's own regional greenhouse gas strategy from 2017 was very broad. We were, it was a kitchen sink approach, but now I think we really need to focus more on the transformational changes. And there are some key barriers apart from the capacity issues that we know very well. We have ever harder goals to meet, harder to meet with local actions. For example, there's been a lot in the chat about EVs and trying to meet these EV goals, and that's the easy part. VMT reduction is we're really at a loss on to how to figure out how to achieve meaningful reductions in VMT. There are still a lot of political challenges that remain for these big hitting transformational approaches. VMT reduction and building electrification and energy efficient, they don't play out the same in different parts of the region. And so they're in different areas. There are different equity challenges. There are different technical challenges, financing challenges, and political challenges, and those still remain. I'd like to say,
Kathy,
yeah.
I am going to need to move to the next speaker.
Okay, that's
wrap
fine.
up in the next 30 seconds or so. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to wrap up with equity challenges, and I wanted to mention that the Air District has recently put out CEQA guidelines that include a chapter on environmental justice and equity and the more procedural and process-focused engagement, and so for planning efforts. And so I'd recommend, I'll put a link in the chat on that.
Really important stuff. We need a day-long workshop probably to get to the bottom of all of these things, but that was an important perspective to have in terms of like hearing from an agency that also has to deal with CEQA thresholds as well, and the importance of connecting the two. So folks are starting to put questions in the chat. Good. We are going to hear from Dr. Boswell first before we move into the Q&A. And he is, so Dr. Boswell is a professor of city and regional planning at Cal Poly, where I went, and he wrote the book on climate action planning. So he's going to give us an overview of the research on local climate action here in California. So thanks for being here, Dr. Boswell.
Thanks, Angie. Thanks for having me. I'm going to, today what I want to talk about is kind of a high level overview of the state of local climate action planning in California. This is based on some research work I've been doing for almost a decade with my colleague at Cal Poly, Dr. Adrian Grieve. And we maintain a California climate action planning database. And I've been working on 2 projects with CARB that is leveraging some of the work out of this database and looking at some of the contents of our climate action plans, city and county that we have in California. So Angie, can you get the PowerPoint going?
Yep,
okay,
I'll set for you.
Okay, so we can, next slide. So first of all, what we've been trying to do for the last decade is keep track of the over 500 jurisdictions in California and what they're doing on climate action planning. This is not easy. I've employed a small army of grad students over the years to assist me with this work. And so we can't guarantee we have 100% accurate account. And of course, the day that we get the database in a solid position, local governments are continuing to take action. So we're always having to update it. But what we think we generally know of about January 1st this year is that 36 of the 58 counties in the state, so 62%, and 281 of the 482 cities, 60 or 59%, have adopted climate action plans in their communities. So those are pretty good numbers, and they're up significantly from a count we did just a few years ago. Although we had a little bit less confidence in that count that we did a few years ago, but we've seen significant increases in the last few years. We're also in the initial phase of doing some analysis of who these communities are. So I don't have a lot to report today, but I think maybe the main interesting observation is the average size of these communities that have a cap and don't have a cap. And I think we just heard some comments that are consistent with this idea. And what we can see here is that larger communities tend to have climate action plans in California, and smaller communities tend not to. And we know this is primarily a resource issue. Let's see. One thing we're also working on, I mentioned it here. One of the things we're also working on is trying to identify who has a qualified climate action plan for CEQA purposes. There's no list of this anywhere in the state. No one knows for sure how many do and do not. We're almost finished with this work, and so we believe that it's going to come out to about 36% of these climate action plans that you're seeing here are going to be qualified climate action plans. And that seems like a low number, but I think it'll be clear in a few more slides as to why that is only 36% of these are qualified caps. Next slide. Just a little additional data. So here we're looking at the population of the state that's actually covered by a climate action plan. And again, I think there's some good news here. Almost 80% of the residents of California are living in communities that have a climate action plan. So this reminds me of the typical 80-20 rule, right? And I think it begs an interesting question about how much effort we really maybe want to put into getting that last 20% of much smaller communities to have a climate action plan versus maybe a more strategic or narrow approach to defining actions that they might take. Let's see. Next slide. Just again, a little bit more in terms of who these communities are. We were quite curious as to how many of the 10 or 20 or so largest communities in the state actually have a climate action plan. This is what we believe to be the case. Again, if anybody knows anything different, or if Bakersfield did something in the last week that I haven't heard about, please let me know. But we can see that of the 10 largest cities, most of them have completed a climate action plan. A couple are in progress, and the only one we're sort of unknown as to where they are in their status is Anaheim. Next slide. And we did the same for counties. So, and this is only, by the way, showing the unincorporated portion of the county, population of the county, because of course, it's almost always the case that the county climate action plans are for the unincorporated portion of the county, although there's a few small exceptions to that. So again, we can see here a little bit less participation from the 10 largest. And again, that might indicate some areas where the state may want to take more specific interest to try to get a larger percentage of the population covered with caps. Okay, next slide. We've done a variety of queries into, so that was all kind of high level descriptive data, right, of kind of what's going on in the state, but we've begun to dig into these caps and try to understand what's in them a little bit more. One of the things we were very interested, because I've started a new research project on this recently about looking at climate neutrality, is what cities and counties that have climate plans are actually adopting climate neutral goals. Even as recently as 5 years ago, most communities were looking at targets that were a percentage reduction off of a baseline emissions, but we've seen in the last few years a lot of communities jump in and say, nope, we're going to go all the way essentially to zero, or at least net zero emissions. So these are just showing the cities that we know of that have 2030, 2035, and 2040 goals. There's a bunch more that have 2045 and 2050 goals, a total of 37 cities and 4 counties having climate neutral goals. But you can see certainly these 2030 and 2035 communities have adopted very aggressive targets to get to climate neutrality. I'm always have to remind myself 2030 is only 7 years away. I'll mention too that I think it's shown here with the asterisk communities, which I believe is just City of Fairfax and City of West Hollywood. These are 2 communities that explicitly
I think I'm not the only one that got a pause there, right? Uh-oh.
That's correct.
That hotel Wi-Fi may be acting up.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, let's I actually think he was just about done with his presentation. So let's see if he comes back. And if not, why don't we might try to address some questions and we'll see if he comes back. So let's see, some of these questions I see for Dr. Boswell, but let me sum up what I'm seeing in the chat for a minute, which is a lot of folks starting to opine and think really interestingly about some good ideas for where they would like the state to step in. Maybe thinking about what the asks could be or what the coordination can really look like between state and local agencies. So I'm appreciating the brainstorming that's already happening here. A lot of, what could we do to build capacity? What can we do to sustain capacity? And I guess what I want to start with for all the speakers is what we're hearing from everybody is climate action plans are hard. They're resource intensive. They take a long time. There's a lot of challenges. And then there's even questions about how do we implement once we have one. We could have the Cadillac of caps. And is it going to work? Are we going to be able to effectively implement it? And I want to ask the speakers, all the local speakers, why did you do a cap? And why does it matter? And so I wonder if any of our local speakers could take that one first. Amory or
I'll maybe I'll jump in. You had a chance to hear from Shelby a little bit. Hi, everybody. I'm Alyssa Mood. I'm the director of the Sustainability Mobility Department here at the City of San Diego. It's our second climate action plan. So it's an update to our 2015, which had ambitious goals then, and setting a net zero by 2035 we knew would be ambitious, but what the team did and under Shelby Bousseau and Mariah Saldana was really identify all of the actions to get there. And so, where we had maybe some strategies before we really actionized the climate action plan in this version, we also did a lot of engagement around really hearing from what our communities, where they see and feel the effects of climate change, and then how that is manifested in those measures or those actions to get to avoiding the greenhouse gas emissions or mitigating for those. And then I'd say the third piece of that is the piece that, and I'll toot Shelby's horn a little bit, is we did a climate action implementation plan. So really being strategic about, okay, here are the actions, but how do we implement those actions? What departments in our city are going to be responsible or participating in those actions? What are the dollars and cents that are needed to implement that over, we did the next 5 years? What is the workforce and labor impacts of that work? Because there are a lot of people's jobs and livelihoods at stake. And so we need to understand what are not only the impact, but what are the solutions to address that greening of the skills of our workforce and our residents. And then also, what are the co-benefits? Because often at the end of the day, what resonates with our public and our elected officials are the co-benefits of an action. And I think that's why here today talking about air quality, so CARB's air quality with climate policy is a really great intersection and example of those co-benefits of as we address the greenhouse gas emissions, we're also working to address air emissions that affect people's people's health and welfare. So that's the reason why we did it. We did it as an update and really set our intentions for the next 12 to 13 years.
Right. Back to that idea that it's in communities, it's not just a math problem. Yes.
And
Anyone
it's a
else?
budget. Wait, I just want to say, and it's a budget problem. So
A budget problem.
we did it as we are embarking on our next budget. So that's the other piece of that.
Right. Like, how do you most effective? What do you get the most bang for your buck? If you're going to invest in these strategies, you want to do the best ones you possibly can with, as cost effectively as you can. Yeah. Anybody else, our other local speakers? And Dr. Boswell, I see your back, so we're going to give you a chance to wrap up your comments in just a minute here.
If I could just jump in real quick and echo Alyssa's point, we're in the process of pulling one together, and like by and large, the main point why we're doing this is to have like an actual roadmap game plan for our board of supervisors to understand what they will actually need to do and what they can do with the monetary constraints that we have to get us to A. And if we can't get to A, then here's how we get to B, and here's how we get to C. So the connection to the dollar and the effort amount and timeline is like the main driver behind why we're pulling ours together.
Right. Yeah. If local governments weren't left to their own devices to pay for all of this, then we could probably just implement whatever list there is, right?
Yeah.
Omri, go ahead.
Yeah, I think in my region, there's three main reasons why there's a cap. There's the first one, of course, is creating that roadmap, and those tend to be more advanced jurisdictions that maybe this is their second map and they really see it as that tool to really implement. Then we've got jurisdictions, it's their first cap, and they're doing it because they're doing a general plan update, and part of the mitigation, it's a mitigation measure for the EIR for their general plan. And then the third time that we're seeing is actually more elected official led, and we're seeing elected officials that want to see climate action in their jurisdictions and are creating subcommittees of the city council and actually leading a public process to do a climate action and a plan. And those are very interesting because there it's more about educating the public and bringing the public on board, and not so much about getting the plan CEQA qualified. So yeah, three different pathways.
I see a question here for Dr. Boswell, and I want to give you a chance to maybe if you could quickly just sum up what we didn't get to hear. And so there's a question here. It says, what does it mean to have an unofficial climate neutral goal?
Some of the caps, very formally say our goal is to be climate neutral by, say, 2035. Others will say things like we're aiming for a certain emissions reduction, and that's kind of our formal target, but our ambition is to be climate neutral by that date. So they kind of have a more firm and a more soft target. So we saw a few of those kinds of targets.
And do you want to sum up maybe your slides before we move into our next piece?
Sure, I'll make a few very quick because I'm worried the internet will drop again.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, hotel Wi-Fi.
We're okay, thank you.
So let me just mention a few things that are, and Angie, the slides will be available, right?
They will. Everybody can get
Yeah. So you're going to see a slide that has when these climate action plans in our database, when they were adopted. And I think there's a few things of concern. One is that over half of these plans were adopted prior to 2016. And as you know, a lot has changed in the last few years. And so I think there's an issue now where we have a lot of climate action plans in California, but a lot of them are getting to be out of date. Most are adopted now more than two, for example, scoping plans ago. I was going to make a point about some missing critical policy areas. So we did kind of a very crude look at what policy issues are being addressed in these climate action plans. We've only done a little bit of assessing of the quality of the policy, but even just looking at sort of a crude measure, we see, for example, only 73% of CAPs addressing electric vehicles, only 26% addressing heat pumps, 31% on energy storage, and only about half on equity or justice issues. And again, this largely has to do with many of them being quite old. And so there's some consistency there. And then also we have done some deep dive on a sample of climate action plans, looking at how they're doing on implementation in a few specific areas on BMT reduction, energy, and electric vehicles, for example. And even where we're seeing pretty good policy, we're seeing very, very little detail in most of these on how they're actually going to be implemented, particularly where funding will come from and what kind of time frame that we're looking at. I still think there's a need for climate action plans. I know this gets discussed a lot. My last slide talks about it. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but I think from the state perspective, there's two critical ones, which is that most local climate action plans are showing that they cannot get to their targets with just depending on state action, that it will take local action. And I know that that's the state's perspective as well, that they can't do it all, that they need local action. So there's still that gap that has to be closed, and it's only going to be closed through local climate action planning and implementation. And then the other is accelerating action. We see a lot of cities now wanting to move faster than the state. And I think the IPCC recent report would suggest that we do need to do that. We do need to move faster, as fast as we can go. So a lot of cities want to move faster. And so those cities are going to help the state get to its targets quicker. And also they're going to be the innovators, right? They're going to set they're going to show us, they're going to show the rest of us how it can potentially be done. So I also included some slides with some good examples that we've drawn out of plans. I'm not going to talk about those. And then I just want to mention one last thing since it came up in the discussion. I've got a group of my graduate students I'll be working with this fall, and we're looking for a community that would like to have us come and assist with their climate action plan. So if you've got a community out there, particularly if you're resource constrained, I've got a group of eager students, and we can come help you work on your climate action plan. And I'll drop something in chat about that, how you can contact me.
Well, that's
Thanks,
a dream
Amy.
come true. Thank you, Dr. Boswell. That's a great offer. Get it while it's hot. Okay, so that was really great. And I'm really happy to, I would actually love, if you have numbers at some point, Dr. Boswell, about the share that local governments, like what share of the state's climate emission reductions really fall within the domain of local government. Like that would be a really helpful number to have, to know what share of responsibility we have.
We did that for CARB a number of years ago, and we've been trying to replicate that, but now the spread on the inventories and the climate action plans in terms of their age is so broad that it doesn't make sense to, for example, look at a community's 2012 climate action plan and their 2010 inventory and say anything about what portion of emissions they're accounting for. So, but we are going to try to figure out a way to get some data on that.
Okay, thank you.